Hello, America, and welcome to Of the People. I'm Robert Chernin with the American Center for Education and Knowledge. Thank you so much for joining us for yet our latest podcast, and this, our first video podcast as well. At ACEK, we will always defend American exceptionalism and the individual freedoms and code of personal responsibility that go along with it. They're the very core of what makes America exceptional. Our goal at ACEK is to arm you with knowledge and education to fight back against the problems of today. In this case, I would call them the progressive hordes. We are thrilled to have back with us today Professor Bruce Abramson. We call him Professor Bruce. He is extremely learned. He has a law degree from Georgetown. He has a PhD from Columbia, well published, expert on all sorts of areas. And if you were with us on our first podcast, Dr. Bruce was with us then. Welcome, Dr. Bruce, back to Of the People.
Thank you, Robert. Always a thrill to be one of the people.
Would you want to be anything else, really? So I have to jump right into this.
Right.
Referenced in the beginning that Louisville is about to riot this evening.
Oh, they're beyond the
Breonna Taylor verdict. The grand jury returned a verdict of, wasn't manslaughter, it was
reckless endangerment.
Right. So, but here's my question. In anticipation of this verdict, there's a video going around where they pulled up a U-Haul truck. And out of the back of the U-Haul truck, they're pulling out baseball bats. There's armed people running around with guns. They're pulling out signs. So who's funding all of this? I mean, who's organizing it? Because that just doesn't appear out of thin air.
Well, I mean, these organizations like BLM and Antifa have been raking in the dough for the past few months. I can't say that I've gone through their books. I don't know more about who's funding them than anybody else, but the corporations have been making donations are all publicly known.
Wait a minute, but if you wanted to send a check to Antifa, is there an organization? Is there a headquarters? Where am I sending my check now that I'm sending my check?
I'm not sure. I don't know. My guess is that most of that money is coming from abroad.
From where?
From abroad.
Abroad like China? Abroad like where?
There's no shortage of bad people abroad. I mean, the goal of, first of all, what you're seeing is real terrorist behavior. And I mean, literally terrorist behavior, or if you think about the working definition of terrorism, it is a statement of, if you do not yield to my political will, I will inflict violence on innocent people in your streets. That is terror, pure and simple, and that's what we're seeing. Who's funding it? I don't know. I could make a guess at the usual suspects. We know which countries want to destabilize the United States. I am sure that it's not going directly from a foreign government to some Yahoo sitting in his mother's basement who's got a bunch of friends who can pull these things together. I'm sure there are cutouts and middlemen, but I mean, there's tons of money around the world to destabilize America.
So somebody's laundering money several times to get it to the protesters. That is when corporate America is not sucking up and writing them checks to be left alone, and so they don't boycott them or.
Yeah, I'm sure that's right. I mean, these things are well funded. They're well orchestrated. You've got the fools who are giving to the GoFundMe campaigns and the bail funds.
Right.
Cosmopolitan magazine, I see, called for donations today. Kamala Harris's, Joe Biden's aides all donated. I mean, there's money coming in from all over. And quite frankly, I mean, what's really scary is that the Democrats range from encouraging this to sitting quietly and being at least okay with it. I mean, it's just absolutely appalling. You heard it over the Supreme Court. If you don't yield to our political will, there'll be increased violence in the streets.
Well, what was it before? Silence is violence, or silence means consent. So if you use their own standards, right? Silence means consent. Well, I guess if the Democrats are silent, they must be consenting to the behavior.
Yes, but in order for hypocrisy to work, people have to have shame.
Good point. Good point. So you mentioned the Supreme Court. Let's segue. I want to talk about that. So
Right.
is it like, I understand that the president's going to put forward, I think on Saturday, his nominee. I would say that's the right thing to do. Certainly constitutionally, he's empowered to do that. But politically, is it the smart thing to do?
Oh, I think so. I think so. I mean, it. First of all, it energizes his base. It puts a concrete name and a face up there.
Right.
Personally, I think he's going to put up Amy Coney Barrett, and then let Kamala Harris
Seventh Circuit, right? Seventh Circuit.
Let Kamala Harris take shots at her for being a woman, and let Joe Biden take shots at her for being Catholic.
Right.
I do not. It's kind of questionable what happened after the Kavanaugh hearings. Right, the Kavanaugh hearings, the Democrats were completely out of control. And then they went into the elections, and they did well. I mean, they won the House in those elections, so that's kind of a reward. But confirmation hearings are in front of the Senate, and the Democrat senators who voted against Kavanaugh did not do well in that election. So where the punishments were direct. I mean, look, if Trump doesn't put it forward, if the Senate gets in his way, that will hurt all the Republican candidates out there. In fact, the best thing you can do politically is take it off the table. I mean, it is much easier for the Democrat operatives to energize their base by saying, get out there and vote, because that guarantees that we'll get a Supreme Court seat, than it is for them to say, get out there and vote to punish Trump. Because all the people who are motivated by that are already going out to vote.
Agreed. I also think it nationalizes the Senate races. So some of them where there may have been local issues, now it's all about the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I think it's
absolutely. I buy that. I buy that.
And I mean, this has to help. Look, the single most vulnerable. If you ask me, will the Republicans lose? You tell me the Republicans will lose only one seat, I would say that's Arizona. But Arizona, yeah. I think that she's the weakest Republican incumbent, and she's got a very strong opponent who's running a good campaign, is well liked in the state, is hard to caricature as a radical.
Right.
And Arizonans have an independent streak. On the other hand, if it comes down to, a Supreme Court nominee, maybe that'll break in her favor. I can't see it breaking against her.
Makes sense. Okay. So I wanted to touch on that. I think, again, I would agree with you. I think that it gets done by November 3rd. It will be, however, interesting to see what happens if the nomination is brought forward and through whatever procedural chicanery the Democrats are able to stall this beyond November 3rd to then have a vote. If Trump wins, it's easy. But, I mean, I don't think you're going to know who the winner is into certainly December, if not early January, based on, I think, the way that they're setting this up to contest the legitimacy of the election, right? Mail-in ballots, ballot harvesting, all of that.
Oh, I agree with that. I've written a lot about that.
Right. So assuming that Trump wins, which I think pretty much is a foregone conclusion, I don't think you're going to know that until well into December. What happens if you have a vote or need to have a vote after Election Day while this works its way through the courts? It just opens the door to questioning the legitimacy, even though constitutionally, I think it's sound. What's your take?
I don't worry about questioned legitimacy because, first of all, we're dealing with crazy people. And they've been questioning the president's legitimacy for the past 4 years. They will question the legitimacy of anyone they don't like. I mean, they questioned the legitimacy of Kavanaugh because they really, really disliked him. They questioned the legitimacy of Gorsuch because,
not to interrupt you, I don't think they disliked Kavanaugh at all. I think it was what he represented, and you could have put anyone in that seat, and they would have savaged and ravaged him. I
think that's true.
Right.
But by now, these people have convinced themselves that he's a gang rapist. Okay? Right. They actually believe that. They made it up and they convinced themselves that it was true. And now that's what they see when they look at him.
Shame. So if the Democrats win, so the way I see this is simple. If Biden somehow wins, the Democrats take the Senate. If Trump wins, the Republicans hold the Senate. That would be, I think, an easy divide to make. So if the Democrats win, they're going to try to pack the courts, add a couple states, and now they're talking about trying to get rid of the Electoral College, which to me is the very glue of what holds the big state, small state, United States together.
Classically, the progressives, the radicals, have pushed the Democratic Party to the point that it is no longer a functioning political party in a democracy. I mean, right now, what you're hearing them talk about is the one man, one vote, one time. They want one more election. That's what they want. After that, they will allow a token opposition. I mean, everybody allows token opposition, right? Because everybody likes, the Soviet Union held elections. Saddam Hussein held elections. I mean, everybody likes the symbolism of holding elections.
It's the veneer. It's the veneer of legitimacy by saying, oh, yes, I'm holding elections.
And what they'll do is they will allow some sort of an opposition party. But as I say, they'll reduce the Republican Party to the Washington Generals. For those who don't know, the Washington Generals are the team that tours with the Harlem Globetrotters. Now, every player on the Washington Generals is a really, really good basketball player. They're all really talented, and they score points.
Right.
They do score points, and
Just
they make great plays. But what they're not supposed to do is win a game.
Right.
They're supposed to play well enough to make it interesting. They're the foils. Nobody buys a ticket to a Harlem Globetrotter game to watch the Globetrotters lose. And the Washington Generals know that.
Oh, I got it. Understood. Okay, so this will be interesting to see how it plays forward. I do want to return. Initially when I invited you back on the show, and thank you for making the time as always, I wanted to really talk about education. And the reason is, if there's one thing that permeates all of what got us here, and we can talk about a lot of levels, right? The curriculum, the intolerance, school choice, all the things we want to touch on, the lack of civics being taught. But education is woven into all of this. It's what keeps the Black community impoverished, in my opinion, in the poorest sections of the country because of the failure of the education system, right? So I want to talk a little bit about all of that. Let's start with school choice. So if I've always been of the opinion that the Black community is like the Hispanic community is like the white community. They want their kids to start off better than they did. They want their kids to have, opportunity and choices. And who cares about the color of your skin, right? It's that content of your character, Martin Luther King, speech, I have a dream speech.
Yep.
How is it that all these years that the Black community has not risen up to demand school choice? I'm a father. I want to send my kid to the best school I can. How is that?
They have demanded school choice, but here's what it really comes down to. All right, there has been a concerted effort to hold our poor ethnic communities down, and it's a concerted effort, by the way, in which everyone has had a part. Because what happens is the left has always been very good at going into poor and ethnic neighborhoods and making their pitch.
Right.
What they do is they scare those folks off about actual Americans, about the American dream. They go into those communities and say, America hates you. They're holding you out. They're taking advantage of you. They're exploiting you. Then what they do is they prop up some leader. They make them fabulously wealthy, give them a tremendous amount of influence, and say, your job.
Jesse Jackson, Al
Sharpton, Maxine Waters.
Right.
Now, we got a new generation coming in with the squad. But their job is to keep those people enraged. Okay? You keep them angry and you keep them feeling victimized. And you get them so angry at what's being done to them that they are too afraid to notice what we're doing to them. Now, that's what the progressives do. It's what the left has done. It's what the Democrats do. It's what those leaders do. The rest of us have played a role because we have accepted one of the great lies out there. We have accepted the idea that these appointed leaders actually speak for their communities, and we're afraid to call them out on anything. And we tend to think, we tend to buy the progressive myth that this is the authentic voice of the street. It's not. So what happens is that the minorities, particularly the poor ones, are afraid of talking to real Americans. They're afraid of talking to anybody but their own leaders and the progressives who come in and talk to them, and they become captive. And as captives, they have no political clout.
Right.
So they go to the Democrats and say, give us school choice or we'll ask you again in 2 years. And a teachers union goes to the Democrats and say, give us school choice or we will stop funding all of your campaigns and we'll go on strike and tell everybody that you're an anti-education party.
Right. And on top of which, let's get rid of the charter schools because they're our competition.
Well, yeah, but I mean, this is why the teachers union has clout among Democrats because they fund them and they threaten to withhold it. And the black community has zero clout among Democrats because, well, until enough of them wise up and start going elsewhere, there's no reason the Democrats should give a damn about it.
So whatever happened to meritocracy, though, right? I mean, the way I grew up, the way you grew up is the best guy, man or woman, whatever, wins. And that's what we really want, right? You want the best of the best. And if you're trying to transcend race and transcend color and transcend biases, microaggressions, or one day, by the way, you need to teach me about microaggressions because I still don't understand that. But what happened to meritocracy?
Well, first of all, you microaggressed against me by assuming that you can call me you without asking what my third person pronoun is. So I am
wait. My daughter came home and told me about that in college some years ago. Yeah. And she told me about the pronouns. My response was, I have 3 pronouns, me, myself, and I.
Yeah.
It wasn't a very long conversation.
Yeah.
So, all right. So I've microaggressed. Is there such a word? Microaggressed?
Yes, there is.
Microaggressed against you?
Yes.
Okay. So is that a noun or a verb, or it depends on how I use it?
Yeah, it just depends on how you use it.
Could be an adjective.
Could be.
Okay. So
sounds like a past tense verb to me.
Talk to me about meritocracy because and it dovetails into tenure, right? I mean, you know, tenure to me is the ultimate safe space. And if I don't have to compete for my job, and if I can say whatever I want, I think there was a professor at, I want to say it was Iowa State, who at the start of the school year basically let her students know that if you don't support Black Lives Matter, and if you are not pro-abortion, you are not allowed to sign up for her course.
You know, it's a funny thing because most people think the way that you do, and they say, I don't see the best people getting ahead. I take it the opposite way. I take it exactly the opposite way. I say academia has a tremendous pool of potential talent to draw on. They've got all the college students that can funnel into grad school. They've got all the grad students that can funnel into faculty. They got the junior faculty that can funnel into tenure. They've got the tenured faculty that can funnel to the most prestigious institutions. I think they're doing an excellent job. In fact, I think that most people who take the time to think about what they're doing do pretty well. The problem is the values and the standards that I would like them to use are not the ones they're using. They are promoting and tenuring the people who do best at what they want people to do well at, not at what I want people to do well at.
All right, wait a minute. Back up. Explain that to me in more detail because I think I understand that, but I'm not sure.
Okay. Here's how it goes.
Wait. You got to remember, you're the guy with a lot of letters after your name. I have no letters after my name. So can you just sort of dumb it down to my level, please?
Sure. All right. Let's take it like this. Suppose you're a new assistant professor. Pick a field. Right. What field do you want to be an assistant professor in?
Me?
You. Pick a field.
Political science.
Okay.
Hardly imaginative.
You're an assistant professor of political science.
Right.
You're just starting out. You got, depending on your school, between 6 and 9 years before you go up for tenure.
Right.
What do you think you need to do to get tenure?
I need to suck up to the establishment so they give me tenure.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, of all the assistant professors to get started this year, which ones will get tenure?
The ones that go along with the culture that is on campus and that doesn't make waves, and that's probably my best answer.
No, but that's exactly right. Okay? Academia is a huge mutual admiration society. That's all it is. Undergrads, students are supposed to impress their professors. The best way to impress a professor is to say, I've seen your work. It is uncanny to me that one person could be so brilliant as to come up with all of that. That's how you impress them early on. Then you start making a push to get through grad school, get your degree,
Right.
become an assistant professor. Take it one step further. I noticed at the end of your last brilliant book, you left some problems open. Well, in the spirit that you set, I have solved one of those open problems. Okay? Now, you've tied yourself to somebody who's ahead of you in the food chain. You flattered them by telling them that not only you thought their work was good, but that it was so good that you were willing to dedicate your own time to improving it and enhancing it. You've got them citations in future work coming out, which of course now they're going to recommend for publication, because the more often their work gets cited, the more prestige they have. Okay?
Right.
And this is how it goes up the food chain. All right, you've got the same groups of people who decide what gets published, what gets tenured, who gets promoted, who gets funded. This is how the entire incentive system works. And it's all a mutual admiration society. When you go up for tenure, the question that's going to get asked, and it will get cloaked in a lot of language, but the senior members of your faculty will get together and say, I've got friends at more prestigious institutions. If our young guys are impressing them, then they're impressed with me for being at a rising institution. If our young guys don't impress my friends at more prestigious universities, then they look down on me because we're not going anywhere.
Okay, all right. So you're starting to give me a headache, not because you are, just trying to understand that in academia.
Well, yeah, but here's the point, and this is exactly what I was saying. You just said that the skill you need is knowing how to suck up to the folks ahead of you. And I'm telling you that the people who get tenured are the ones who are best at that skill. And then you wonder why they're not also the best writers or researchers. And the answer is some of them are excellent writers and researchers. Most of them aren't, because that's an ancillary skill.
You see, to me, it was always the fact that the hippies of the 60s needed a job, so they didn't want to go out in the real world to work because they couldn't live in the land where you only get to eat what you kill. So what's a good place to go? Let's go teach on a college campus. And oh, by the way, once we get tenure, we're protected, and then we can push whatever social ideas or curriculum that we want. I mean, my biggest issue, one of my biggest issues, I have several, Lord knows, is we don't teach civics anymore, right? My issue is meritocracy. I want to earn, this is the old John Houseman commercial. They earned it. Remember that? We're old enough to remember that.
So Smith Barney.
Was it Smith?
Yeah.
Well, John Houseman was the spokesman.
Yeah.
He was the actor.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
I always thought it was John Hancock. Might have been Smith Barney. But so meritocracy was one issue.
I don't know. John Houseman for John Hancock sounds a little redundant.
Could be. We'll compare commercial knowledge or knowledge of old commercials later.
All right.
So for me, it's meritocracy.
Okay.
And I've lived in the land where you only get to eat what you kill since I've been in my 20s, which is obviously a long time ago. But then it's the issue of civics.
Yeah.
And if you ask a 20-year-old how the government works, if you ask them how the country was founded, if you ask them the principles upon which the country was founded, my guess is you'll get about a 10% response ratio getting it correct, and the rest of them are going to have some sort of reaction that is somewhat akin to, huh? I don't know.
Well, let's see. The country was founded on the principles of slavery, exploitation, and Jesus, right?
And systemic racism, which would be your slavery argument. Yeah,
Yeah.
look, I understand that, but my point is this: that how when we ceded ground and we gave up fighting over what curriculum our kids were taught, right? So when my kids were in elementary school, most of the parents basically said, and to one degree or another, here, you teach my kid, right? So they gave over to me what is a sacred obligation, which is to
Yep.
teach your children, right? I think that's a Crosby, Stills and Nash song, right? Is teach your children. But most people give them over to elementary school or the educational system to teach them, and then they don't get involved in what curriculum is taught. And when I saw some of the curriculum, and
Yeah.
by the way, it was much more genteel than it is now. I've seen some of the college textbooks. I am at a loss for words that that's accepted and not challenged based on what? Based on the curriculum they're teaching and based on the fact that there's no civics being taught about here's who you are as a citizen of this country, here's what's expected of you, here's the value system that you're supposed to be taught. So to me, we lost that somewhere in the 60s into the 70s, but I don't know. What say you to this? I mean,
Well,
you're
we did
not the
lose
letter
it.
control your name.
Okay, we did lose it, but let's not mythologize public education or even education in general.
Okay.
Public education came about in the 19th century largely as an outgrowth of nationalism. And it came about really, I think the French were the first ones to do it, but you needed a nationalized curriculum. You needed a public curriculum so that you could teach people civics, right? And you could teach them what it meant to be a citizen, and you could standardize things like your language and your modes of communication and exchanges. Now, it also happened to coincide with the period of industrialization. So you needed to teach people new skills that included things like reading, writing, and arithmetic. But at the end of the day, my immigrant great grandparents sent their kids to public schools, and my grandparents were in a generation where if you had an immigrant sounding name, they gave you an English one, and if you had an accent, they fixed it. And quite frankly, if you used your left hand, which I do, they smacked it. Right? So the idea that we weren't always inculcating a set of values is really, it's a flawed mythology. Now the question is, when did we lose the values that were underpinning America and start propagandizing to inculcate this radically bizarre set of values that are coming out today?
So let me interrupt you.
Yeah.
If I hear you clearly, you're saying that the educational system was a reflection of already having lost the values, not the other way around. Because to me, it was the people who sort of hid within the educational system. It's sort of like through the 1960s, they started and they just kept at it over time because they were in this cloistered, obviously they call it an ivory tower, cloistered environment where they weren't challenged academically and they were allowed to pursue whatever theory or theories they wanted, no matter how, I would hate to use the word subversive, but I'm hard pressed to think of something else at this point. So, this is a chicken and egg argument. You're telling me it went from the culture into the education, not from the educational system into the culture?
Well, I think you have to go back to the incentive system inside academia, which is, again, it's about flattering the guy who came before you. That creates, and this is a term that I've coined that I know because I've looked it up and nobody else uses it. I call the incentive system incremental outrageousness. All right. What it means is that I get ahead by being slightly more outrageous than the guy who came before me. That way I'm building on past work, so it seems credible. And but I'm pushing it further, which is where the outrage comes from. And so what you end up doing is you get these bizarre tangents that people go on because everybody's going in the same direction, one step at a time further from reality. And over the course of decades, those steps get you pretty far from reality. It's a self-perpetuating system. And once you've picked your direction, you're just out there. And since the initial direction that was chosen was leftward, are completely divorced from reality, out in left field, literally.
All right. So a la Hansel and Gretel, how do we find our way back without the breadcrumbs? Right? How do you fight back? How do you look? You and I have had these discussions even outside this podcast, right? Which is that we've lost control of those institutions, the cultural institutions, the educational institutions, and even government institutions.
Right.
I would argue that of those, the most fundamental, which is why I wanted to talk to you about sort of education throughout, the common theme tonight, which is it took us generations to get here. It's going to take us generations of fighting to get back.
Yes, it will.
Right. I think Trump wins. Okay. I think that's true. I think one of the things that President Trump has done is lead by example. What example? He's teaching most of America how to fight back, right? Because most of America never fought back. That they were silenced through political correctness. But even with fighting back, let's assume my assumption is correct, right? How do you regain control of the educational system, understanding that it's going to take at least a generation, if not more? Where do you begin?
You regain it slowly. You talked about school choice. The thing about school choice is you start getting competition. So you break the monopoly of the teachers' unions. We actually have to go away from national standards, or at least minimize the number of subjects you have in national standards, so that you can, to quote to quote a good progressive, let a million flowers bloom. That's what we do in K-12, is we've got to break the monopoly of the teachers' unions and the uniformity that they impose. And that way you start getting schools back one at a time. Higher education, you can't reform their internal dynamics until you reform the way that they make money. Interestingly, one of the few rare positive benefits of COVID is that the isolation has exposed the hollowness of American education at all levels. And people get it.
Explain that. What do you mean by hollowness? Explain that.
Well, first of all, you have a huge number of parents who have listened into their kids' classes, have had to sit with their kids, have had to do more teaching on their own, and quite frankly, have seen how little their kids have suffered in terms of education for not being in school for several months. Right? So
the kids haven't suffered, but the parents have.
Yes. But the point is that their maturation and growth and knowledge, I mean, what they've missed most is socialization. Right?
Of course.
So you have, I believe that you have a much savvier parent population of school-age children now than we ever have before, because there's just more insight into what goes on in a classroom. That's good. Second of all, you've got a situation where, as here in New York, I've got my kids in private school. They started August 31st. They are almost done with a complete month of school. It's been uninterrupted. The public schools are still talking about when they're going to open. It is, and New York is not the only place that's happened. Right now, in America today, if your kids are enrolled in a private school, there is a far better chance that they will have something approximating an in-person school year than if they're in public school. That is unfair, but it creates a market. At the higher education level, it's absolutely appalling. You've got universities that are charging full tuition for students to take correspondence courses. You can't justify that. I mean,
but you were talking about the funding system. The funding system is from not only the tuition, but the alumni, right? The endowments, the Ivy League endowments, and a lot of the larger universities are staggering numbers at this point.
They are, but you have to remember, the thing about an endowment, you don't use your endowment to fund operations. Right? Maybe you use the return to fund operations, but you don't touch it. When you've got a university that's cutting into the principle of its endowment, you got a university that's in trouble.
Well, so Dartmouth has I want to say $6 billion endowment. They'd
Yeah,
have to cut into it a lot
they
before there's
do.
a problem.
Well,
And most of the Ivy Leagues are equally as well endowed.
yeah,
No pun intended, or pun intended, I guess.
yeah. Well,
So wait a minute, but go back to the incentive, not the incentive system, the funding system,
the funding
right?
system.
So I understand you've got to sort of choke out the money, right? And you
But
have to cultivate something akin to the right to work movement.
you know that university tuition has grown at 3 times the inflation rate for 4 decades.
Well, I'm not arguing the facts. I'm arguing. My question is, I mean, you're the smart guy on this podcast. I'm trying to figure out how do you fight back? Because and for everyone who's listening, Dr. Bruce has a book out called American Restoration, right?
Yeah.
Winning the Second American Civil War, which I have read, and you do talk about this, but you are the smarter guy here. So how do you fight back? Because I got part of that in the book, but I didn't get enough of it in that book.
So more on point, I've got a book specifically about education, about the education system, these incentive structures. It'll come out early next year.
Okay, so we can plug the title. Do we have a title yet?
Well, I was working on a working title called "The Cultivate America," about the cult of expertise, but I think that will end up in a dustbin somewhere.
Okay, when you have the title, we'll have you back on. But
all right,
how do you fight back? Because what we've always tried to do at ACEK, as you know, is to be pragmatic and give people tools to fight back in small degrees and in large degrees. Because it does come down to fighting back, not just taking it anymore.
The biggest problems we have with the biggest problem we have at universities are that they are completely unaccountable corporations. Right? I mean, everybody else, they make a product, you buy it, it doesn't work, you can sue them. They do something that doesn't work on a massive scale, they get hit with a class action. Universities are completely unaccountable. We've made them unaccountable. We've guaranteed that they can keep hiking their prices because we guaranteed student loans for tuition. They don't have to be upfront with their students about the value of what they're selling them. They pad everything. We've got a million regulations that go to universities, which gives them excuses to pad their employment roles with administrators who do nothing except make life miserable. I mean, they run these campuses. You have to completely rethink the approach to higher education. You talk about Dartmouth, you talk about your Ivy League, fine. Okay?
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
This is not about rethinking. We all agree that you need to rethink. The question is, tactically, I'm a tactical guy, right? Tactically, so in the next 2 years, what are concrete steps that we should be taking to start fighting back and regaining control of the educational system? You can start at look, I agree that local control is better. I went through, when my children were in elementary school, we were in Vermont, we got designated as a gold town or a giving town as opposed to a receiving town. And what really bothered me was not that we were sending money to the state that was being distributed, but we as the parents in the town wanted to do more for our children. So we agreed to put together our own fund and raised our own money to have more assets available, to be able to offer more services, better education to our children. The state said to us we couldn't do that. So it wasn't bad enough that we were sending money to the state. Fine, I understand that. But we weren't even allowed to control our own destiny and do more to help our own community to do that. So I'm all for local control of education. But concrete, you're the doctor, help me, next year or two, what steps do we need to take as communities? What step do we need to take as a country? Not what do I think?
Okay. All federal funding for education should flow to parents, not the states, not the school districts, not the schools. It should flow to parents in the form of vouchers. Higher education Stop guaranteeing student loans for people taking worthless classes. Make the universities accountable for the loans that they're taking in via tuition. Those would be two great places to start. Start imposing regulations on universities. There's really no reason. I mean,
so what kind of regulations?
Kind of regulations?
Yeah, give me an example.
All right. If you want to qualify for federal student loans, you have to have a minimum. You have to have a minimum teaching load. You have to maintain a minimum ratio of full-time faculty to adjunct teaching and full-time faculty to administrators. Maybe impose an unbundling, right? If you're offering correspondence classes, you can't charge students for student life program, for student life, campus life for that. There are lots of ways to change the way that universities get their funding. Because universities really have three products that they bundle together. One is teaching and education, two is research, and three is campus life. And you can do a better job of demanding clean accounting to show that they're not cross-subsidizing. Right? Okay. Why in the world?
That's helpful. So one last thing I want to talk about education before we wrap up for today. The great disruptor. One of the things when I was doing some research before we had this podcast is Google, it seems, is now putting out their own educational system or having their own, what I would call sort of a technology, vocational technology degree, where it's a 6-month program, there's a certification, it is exponentially less expensive, and Google being the great disruptor, what kind of impact will things like that have on the education system? Because I'm a firm believer that, and you had touched on it, unless there's, you have to affect the money, but unless there's competition, again, meritocracy, there's that word again. Unless there's competition amongst the teachers, amongst universities, and I think at some point that competition, look, I'm a little skeptical about Google, to be sure, but and their intentions, but I think as the disruptor, how much of a disruption will that be, and what's, if that permeates Silicon Valley or the technology sector where they come out with these, what I call micro degrees, but certification at it's sort of like it's like learning to be a plumber back in the day, but now you're doing it for technology. It's vocational.
It has the potential to be huge. You know, the big question, the big thing that people get from degrees, they talk about how people earn more money. It's because HR departments and bosses hire people with degrees. There are so many rules about what you're allowed to ask people, what you're allowed to talk to them about on interviews, what you're allowed to solicit in a job application, that it's very hard to get clues. The university degrees are basically viewed as a big sort. Right? If you have a candidate with a bachelor's degree and a candidate who doesn't have a high school degree, that conveys information to the people who do the hiring. When the people who do the hiring start looking at alternative degrees and saying, you know what, I want somebody who possesses this particular technical skill, and they got one in this 6-month program sponsored by a corporation, and there's no particular reason that I should value somebody with a college degree over it, then the college degree will start losing its cachet. But
you know what, that's tough. Look, I agree with you. I think that Google and companies like that are the great disruptors, and I think that will be part of whether they mean it or not, meaning whether they intend that to be the result. I think that will be one of the results in terms of challenging sort of the institutional educational structure that we have going forward.
Oh, it should. It should.
Yeah, if we don't get control of the education, I don't care who the president is. I don't care who runs the Congress. I mean, it does come down to today's children are tomorrow's leaders, and it's how you educate them, right?
Hey, look, you know that I have never been a movement conservative, and I'm not sure if I think of myself as a conservative. I think of myself as a counter-revolutionary.
Okay.
I mean, you can't conserve what we've already lost.
Right. No, true.
We have several generations with no sense of civic attachment to the country. What the hell are you trying to conserve? You're trying to restore. We are counter-revolutionaries today. We are no longer conservatives.
You know, I've always thought of myself these days as a dinosaur. I'm not sure I thought of myself as a counter-revolutionary, but perhaps. You know, this has been, Dr. Bruce, this has been an excellent conversation and very stimulating. You and I could go on talking for hours, but I really want to thank you for making the time to join us on this podcast. And when the new book is out, I want to know the name.
Yep.
And please come back on. Really appreciate you coming.
It's always fun. I'm here anytime, and I look forward to the day that we can actually be in the same room.
Folks, that's all we have time for in this week's podcast. Thank you so much for listening and our great conversation with Dr. Bruce and his book, American Restoration, How to Win the Second American Civil War. Remember, at ACEK, we believe in American exceptionalism and the code of personal responsibility and individual freedoms that underpin it. ACEK is a nonpartisan think tank, and our goal really is not to affect public policy. Our goal is to mobilize public opinion and connect all the red dots in the blue pond. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, on Instagram, tell your friends about us, sign up for our emails, and don't forget to sign up for our podcast so they download automatically into your feed. I leave you with the following quote. I'm an American, free-born and free-bred, and I acknowledge no man as my superior except based on his worth. Theodore Roosevelt. Folks, I'm Robert Chernin. We're ACEK, and we are of the people. Thank you so much for joining us today.